Welcome back, everyone. We're diving deep today into the world of rainbowfish reproduction, and we're heading all the way to the rainforest streams of northern Queensland, Australia, our source material. A fascinating research paper from 2001 by Pusey and his team. They focused on three specific species: Melanotaenia splendida, Melanotaenia eachamensis, and Cairnsichthys rhombosomoides.
What really grabbed me about this study was how it kind of flipped the script on what we thought triggered spawning in fish.
Interesting. But before we jump into the nitty-gritty, could you paint us a picture of where these fish actually live?
Oh, absolutely. So picture this, the wet tropics region of northern Queensland. High rainfall, dense rainforest. And cutting through these rainforests, you have these streams. Now, these streams, they experience really distinct wet and dry seasons.
Yeah, I can imagine. Wet season, torrential downpours, flash floods, the whole works.
You got it. And then the dry season, well, things get a lot calmer and drier, obviously.
I bet that makes raising a family, a whole different ball game for fish.
You're telling me. Now, the three rainbow fish species we're looking at today, they each have their own little niche in this region.
Right.
MS splendida, they're kind of the generalists, found at various elevations. Then you have M. inchamensis, our high elevation specialist, only found above 700 meters. And last but not least, C. rhombosomoides, they prefer the lowlands, sticking to areas below 100 meters.
So right off the bat, we're seeing that these fish are adapted to very different environments. What did the researchers discover about how these adaptations affect their reproductive strategies?
One of the first things that popped up was that all three species can technically spawn year-round.
Mm.
Like, they could be making babies all the time.
Yeah.
But here's the catch. They observed that the vast majority of spawning happened during the dry season, from August to November.
That's interesting. Any idea why they'd concentrate their baby-making efforts during the dry season?
Remember those flash floods we talked about? Well, the dry season, with the lower water levels and calmer flow, it creates a much more stable environment for eggs and larvae.
Makes sense.
In fact, the researchers found that larval fish abundance actually peaked during the dry season. Really supports the idea that this timing is crucial for their survival.
Right, it's all about giving their offspring the best shot at making it. But what about things like water temperature and daylight hours? Don't those usually play a role in fish spawning?
You'd think so, right. That was the prevailing theory for a long time. But this study, it didn't find any solid evidence to back that up. For example, M. eachamensis, they spawn during the cooler months, which goes against the whole warmer temperatures trigger spawning idea.
So if it's not temperature or daylight, what's calling the shots when it comes to their reproductive timing?
The study suggests that reaching a certain size and packing on enough energy reserves, that seems to be the key.
Okay, so like hitting a growth milestone.
Exactly. And these rainbow fish, they mature pretty quickly, usually within their first year. The researchers saw that the progression through their reproductive stages was really closely tied to their growth.
So it's like they're on this mission to grow up fast and make babies as soon as they've got enough energy stored up.
You nailed it. It's all about maximizing their reproductive output in a relatively short lifespan.
Now, you mentioned that these fish are found at different elevations. Did the researchers find any differences in their spawning timing based on location?
That's where things get really interesting. M. eachamensis, our high elevation friend, they kick off spawning about a month earlier than the other two.
A whole month?
Yep. And they also found that the high elevation population of MS splendida, they also start breeding earlier than their lowland counterparts.
I wonder why that would be.
Well, the researchers think that the different environments might be affecting how fast they grow, and as a result, their reproductive timing.
So location really does play a big role, but why would the high elevation fish be growing faster? Do they have access to some secret stash of high protein fish food up there?
Huh, not quite. It might have to do with something called stream productivity.
Stream productivity, what's that all about?
Basically, it's how much energy is available in the stream ecosystem. And this is influenced by things like nutrient availability, which in turn can be affected by, get this, the type of rock the water flows over.
Hold on, are you saying the type of rock can affect how much food is available for the fish?
Exactly. In this case, streams draining basalt soils, which you find at higher elevations, tend to be more nutrient-rich. This could lead to faster growth and earlier reproduction for the rainbow fish living there.
That's incredible. It's like the landscape itself is shaping the lives of these fish.
You got it. It just goes to show how interconnected everything is.
Okay, so we've got elevation and rock type playing a role. But wait, there's more, right? You mentioned something about a population in Polly Creek that threw a wrench into things.
Ah, yes, Polly Creek. This is where things get really intriguing. The MS splendida population there, they had a much longer spawning period than in other locations.
Longer. How much longer are we talking?
Well, their spawning season actually extended way beyond the typical dry season period. And on top of that, they seem to invest less energy in reproduction overall compared to other MS splendida populations.
That's strange. Any theories on why they'd be doing that?
That's the million-dollar question. What's so special about Polly Creek that could be driving these differences? Is it the food availability, predator pressure, or maybe some other environmental factor we haven't even considered?
It's a real head scratcher. But before we get too caught up in the mysteries of Polly Creek, let's talk about fecundity.
Okay, fecundity, it essentially means the number of eggs a fish produces. It's a key part of their reproductive strategy.
Right, and I'm guessing our three rainbow fish species have some interesting variations in this area.
You bet they do. When we compare the three, some clear differences pop up. M. eachamensis, our high elevation buddy, they're the most fecund.
Meaning they produce the most eggs.
Exactly. Not only do they produce the most eggs, but their eggs are also the largest of the three, over 1.2 millimeters in diameter. Now, on the flip side, C. rhombosomoides have the lowest fecundity.
So we have our high elevation species pumping out a bunch of large eggs, and our lowland species producing fewer, smaller eggs. Is there a connection between their habitat and their fecundity?
That's what the researchers think. They suggest that these different reproductive strategies might reflect the specific challenges of each species' environment. Think about M. eachamensis, living in a limited high-elevation habitat. They have a shorter window for spawning and probably face more limited resources.
So their strategy is to invest heavily in a smaller number of offspring, giving them the best chance of survival.
Exactly. It's like they're putting all their eggs in one basket, so to speak, to maximize their chances of success in a tough environment. And to measure this investment, researchers use something called the GSI, or Gonatosomatic Index.
GSI. What exactly is that?
The GSI, it's basically a measure of how much energy a fish is pouring into reproduction. It's calculated by comparing the weight of the gonads, the reproductive organs, to the total body weight of the fish. A higher GSI means they're investing more in reproduction.
Okay, that makes sense. So what do they find about the GSIs of our three rainbow fish species?
Well, as you might expect, M. eachamensis had the highest GSI. Reflects their strategy of heavy investment in a short, concentrated spawning season. C. rhombosomoides, on the other hand, had the lowest GSI.
So they're taking a different approach, maybe spreading their reproductive effort out over a longer period.
Exactly. And remember, MS splendida, our generalist, their GSI was somewhere in between, reflecting their more flexible strategy, which lets them thrive across a wider range of habitats.
This is fascinating. It's like each species has fine-tuned its reproductive strategy to perfectly match its environment.
Exactly. It's a classic example of how evolution shapes life history strategies to fit the environment. But it's not just the physical environment. Competition for resources and predators can also shape these strategies.
Oh, right. Of course. It's like an evolutionary arms race, with fish constantly evolving new ways to outsmart their rivals and avoid becoming someone's lunch. So tell me, what are some of the other strategies fish have developed? Are there any examples from other parts of the world that mirror what we're seeing with these rainbow fish?
Absolutely. You see these remarkable parallels in fish reproductive strategies all around the globe. And it's often driven by, you guessed it, similar environmental pressures. Take, for example, fish that live in those temporary ponds or streams, the ones that dry up seasonally.
Yeah, those environments sound pretty tough just to make a living, let alone raise a family.
Right. But these fish, they've evolved some incredible adaptations to deal with it. Some species lay these drought-resistant eggs. They can survive for months in the dried-up mud, just waiting for the rain to come back.
Wow, so it's like their development is on pause.
Exactly. They enter a state of suspended animation until conditions are right again. And these eggs, they often have a special shell that keeps them from drying out completely.
It's amazing how life finds a way, isn't it? But you also mentioned that competition and predators can play a role in shaping reproductive strategies. Can you give us some examples of that?
Oh, definitely. Think about fish living in predator-heavy environments. Some species have evolved to just pump out massive numbers of eggs. It's like they're flooding the system with offspring, hoping that at least a few will make it to adulthood.
The numbers game, huh?
Exactly. Then you have other fish that have gotten really good at timing and location. They reproduce at very specific times or in specific spots to minimize that risk of predation.
Okay, so like playing it smart, not just relying on sheer numbers.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Like some coral reef fish, they sync their spawning with lunar cycles. They release their eggs during the night when those predators are less active.
Clever. Using the environment to their advantage. I bet some fish take a more, shall we say, hands-on approach to protecting their young.
Oh, you bet. Some fish are incredibly devoted parents. They go to great lengths to guard those eggs and young.
Like what kind of things?
Well, cichlids, for instance, they're famous for their parental care. Some species will even hold their eggs in their mouths to protect them from predators.
Wow, talk about dedicated. So we've got fish that lay drought-resistant eggs, fish that produce a ton of offspring, fish that time their spawning just right, and fish that are like super parents. Seems like there's a whole range of reproductive strategies out there.
There really is, and it all boils down to maximizing reproductive success no matter what challenges their environment throws at them.
Which brings us back to our rainbow fish in northern Queensland. We were discussing how their fecundity varies and how their strategies seem tied to their specific habitats.
Right, and when you think about the challenges M. eachamensis face up in those high elevation habitats, their strategy of producing lots of large eggs, it makes perfect sense. They're basically going all in on a smaller number of offspring, giving them the best possible start in life.
It's like they're giving their offspring a VIP pass to survival. But what about sea rhombosomoides, our lowland species with the lower fecundity? Why would they produce fewer eggs?
Well, remember how we talked about stream productivity and how it can change depending on the elevation and rock type? Those lowland streams where sea rhombosomoids hang out, they tend to be less productive than the higher elevation streams.
So less food available for their offspring.
Exactly. It could explain why they produce fewer eggs. They might not have the resources to support a big brood.
It's incredible how these seemingly small differences in habitat can have such a huge impact on their reproductive strategies.
It really is, and it highlights why it's so important to understand these connections if we want to conserve these species.
Speaking of conservation, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on how this knowledge can help us protect these rainbow fish, especially with all the challenges they're facing, like habitat loss and climate change.
That's a critical question. Knowing when, where, and how these fish reproduce is absolutely fundamental for effective conservation. We need to protect those specific habitats they need for spawning. Make sure the water quality and flow regimes are good for the eggs and larvae to survive. And we might even need to think about moving some fish from healthy populations to areas where they've declined.
So, like giving them a helping hand to reestablish themselves.
Exactly. And understanding their different reproductive strategies can help us tailor those conservation efforts. Like knowing that M. eachamensis puts so much energy into that short, concentrated spawning season, it highlights how crucial it is to protect their spawning grounds during that time.
It's like a critical window for their survival.
Right. And for species like sea rhombosomoids that might be more sensitive to habitat degradation because of their lower fecundity, we might need to focus on restoring those degraded habitats. Give them a better chance at reproductive success.
It sounds like there's a lot we can do to help these fish thrive, but only if we understand their unique reproductive needs.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Knowledge is power when it comes to conservation.
Well said. But before we wrap things up, I have one last question that's been bugging me. We've talked about drought-resistant eggs, massive spawning events, perfectly timed spawning, and even mouth brooding. But do any of our rainbow fish species show parental care? Do they guard their eggs or their young after they hatch?
That's a great question. And it seems like we've covered almost every reproductive strategy under the sun today. So, do our rainbow fish friends go above and beyond and actually care for their offspring after they hatch? Well, it turns out rainbow fish, generally speaking, aren't big on parental care. They tend to go with what we call a scatter spawning strategy.
Scatter spawning, what does that involve?
Basically, they release their eggs and sperm into the water, often among plants or over rocks, and then, well, that's it. They leave those eggs to fend for themselves.
No nest building or guarding?
Nope, no mouth brooding either. Just a hope for the best approach.
So it's a high risk, high reward kind of strategy.
Exactly. They produce a ton of eggs, scatter them around, and hope enough survive to keep the population going.
And we talked about how the timing of their spawning, especially during the dry season, boosts the chances of those offspring surviving.
Right. Spawning when the stream conditions are more stable, it gives those eggs and larvae a better shot at avoiding those rough flood events.
It really is amazing how everything comes back to those environmental challenges And the creative ways these fish have adapted to overcome them.
Absolutely. Their whole life cycle, from when they spawn to how many eggs they produce to the lack of parental care, it all reflects this fine-tuned balance between maximizing their reproductive output and dealing with the pressures of their environment.
Makes you realize how much we can learn from just observing the natural world, right? These rainbow fish are like living textbooks on adaptation and survival.
I couldn't agree more. And it just underscores how important it is to study and understand these species, not just for the sake of knowledge, but for their conservation too. Yeah. The more we know about how they've adapted and what makes them vulnerable, the better we can protect them as things keep changing.
Absolutely. Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today, from the rainforests of northern Queensland to the fascinating world of fish reproduction. What are some of the key takeaways you hope our listeners will remember from this deep dive?
I think the biggest one is just a sense of wonder and appreciation for the sheer diversity of life on our planet and the incredible ways that organisms have figured out how to survive, even in the toughest environments.
Couldn't agree more. What else?
I'd also emphasize how interconnected ecosystems are. We saw how everything from the type of rock to the predators can influence how these rainbow fish reproduce. It's a powerful reminder that even small changes in the environment can have these ripple effects throughout the whole system.
So we can't just focus on protecting individual species. We need to look at the whole picture.
Exactly. And lastly, I hope this deep dive has sparked some curiosity in our listeners. There's so much more to learn about these amazing fish and about all the other wonders of nature out there waiting to be discovered.
Well said. So to our listeners, if you're interested in learning more about rainbow fish, their habitats, or even just fish ecology in general, there's a ton of resources out there. Online, in libraries, through conservation organizations, you'll be surprised what you find.
And who knows, maybe you'll even be inspired to do your own deep dive into the mysteries of the natural world. There's always something new to discover, and that's what makes it so exciting.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of rainbow fish reproduction. Until next time, keep exploring, stay curious, and never stop learning.